December 8, 1944. Somewhere in the frozen Ardennes forest of Belgium, Captain Robert Chen pressed his headset against his ear and heard nothing but the maddening crackle of static. Behind him, 3,200 men spread across 16 square miles waited for coordinates that would never come. The SCR-300 radio, America's most advanced battlefield communication system, had failed at the worst possible moment. What none of them knew was that salvation would arrive not from a team of engineers or a supply drop of replacement parts, but from a 17-year-old girl in a New Jersey factory who had never finished high school and whose entire solution would cost less than the price of a candy bar. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. This is the account of how Margaret Flynn, a wire assembly inspector earning 62 cents an hour, identified and solved a critical design flaw that had stumped military engineers for 8 months, and how her ingenious modification using a common hairpin would transform battlefield communications and alter the outcome of several critical operations in the final months of the European conflict. The story begins not in Belgium, but 9 months earlier, in March of 1944 at the Signal Corps Engineering Laboratories in Fort Monmouth, New Jersey. Lieutenant Colonel Howard Brennan stood before a table covered with disassembled radio components, his face reflecting the frustration that had consumed his team for weeks. The SCR-300 series, which had entered production the previous year, was experiencing an intermittent failure that defied explanation. Sergeant Michael Torres, the lead radio technician, had tested 47 different units. His reports documented the same perplexing pattern. The radios functioned perfectly during bench tests, passed every quality control inspection, and worked flawlessly in moderate conditions. But in extreme cold, specifically when temperatures dropped below 20 degrees Fahrenheit, approximately 30% of units experienced catastrophic signal degradation. The timing couldn't have been worse. Production facilities across 7 states were manufacturing these radios at a rate of 800 units per week. 12,000 had already been shipped overseas. The military had committed $1.4 million to the program, and commanders in Europe were depending on these radios for the upcoming winter operations. Major Patricia Kowalski, one of only 14 women serving as technical officers in the Signal Corps, had been assigned to investigate the field reports. She had spent 2 weeks interviewing radio operators from units stationed in Italy's Apennine Mountains, where the problem first manifested. The pattern was consistent and terrifying. Radio operators would establish clear communication, then as temperatures dropped during night operations, the signal would fade to nothing. By morning, when temperatures rose, the radios worked perfectly again. The failure wasn't random, Kowalski observed. It happened during the most critical moments when troops needed communication most desperately. During one operation in the Italian mountains, a company of 215 men had spent 11 hours cut off from command because their 3 radios all failed simultaneously. They survived, but the experience had shaken confidence in the entire communication system. Back in New Jersey, the investigation intensified. Engineers subjected radios to temperature chambers, vibration tests, and humidity stress. They replaced vacuum tubes, checked solder connections, and tested every component individually. Nothing explained the failure. The radios continued to pass every test, while soldiers in the field reported the same maddening pattern of cold weather breakdowns. This is where Margaret Flynn enters the story, though no one at Fort Monmouth knew her name yet. She worked the second shift at the Continental Radio Manufacturing Plant in Newark, one of the largest suppliers of military radio components. Her job was to inspect wire harnesses before they were installed in the radio chassis. It was considered simple work, the kind assigned to women with limited technical training. Margaret earned less than half what male assemblers made, despite working the same hours with the same attention to detail. She had started at Continental 6 months after her 18th birthday, following her older brother Thomas to the factory gates. Thomas worked in the machine shop, operating the heavy press that stamped metal chassis components. He had tried to get Margaret assigned to a more prestigious position, perhaps in the testing department, where women operated oscilloscopes and signal generators. But the supervisor had looked at Margaret's education record, noted she had left school after 9th grade to help support her family, and assigned her to wire inspection. Margaret didn't complain. The work paid better than the textile mill where she had spent the previous 3 years. More importantly, she understood she was contributing to something larger than herself. Her brother's best friend had been part of the operations in North Africa. Every radio she inspected might help bring someone like him home safely. What set Margaret apart wasn't her education or her title. It was her attention to patterns. Where other inspectors checked components against a standardized list, Margaret noticed relationships. She observed how different wire gauges responded to bending. She noticed which types of insulation became brittle in cold conditions. She tracked defect rates across different suppliers and manufacturing batches. She kept a small notebook, recording observations that no one had asked for. In November of 1944, Continental received a new contract specification. The military had modified the SCR 300 wiring harness, adding redundant connections to improve reliability. The change seemed minor, but it required inspectors to verify additional solder points. Margaret's supervisor, Mr. Donnelly, a gruff man who had managed the wire department for 12 years, gathered the inspection team and distributed updated specification sheets. Margaret studied the new diagrams during her lunch break. Something bothered her about the modification. The additional wiring ran parallel to the primary frequency oscillator leads, separated by less than 3/16 of an inch. In her notebook, she had observations about electromagnetic interference between parallel conductors. The spacing seemed insufficient. She approached Mr. Donnelly at the end of her shift. He was reviewing production reports, tallying the day's output on a clipboard. "Excuse me, Mr. Donnelly," Margaret said. "I have a question about the new specification." Donnelly looked up, clearly impatient. "It's straightforward. Flynn, additional inspection points are marked in red. Check each solder joint meets Class A standards." "I understand that," Margaret continued, "but I'm concerned about the spacing between the new redundant wiring and the oscillator leads. In cold conditions, wire insulation contracts. If these lines get any closer, we might see signal interference." Donnelly's expression shifted from impatience to something approaching condescension. "Flynn, the specification comes from military engineers, people with degrees. They've considered every factor. Your job is to inspect what they design, not to redesign it." Margaret felt her face flush, but she persisted. "I've been tracking cold weather returns from our military contracts. We've had an unusual number of SCR 300 units flagged for field failures. The failure rate increases in cold weather. This modification might make it worse." Donnelly set down his clipboard. "Listen carefully," he said. "The military employs hundreds of engineers. They conduct extensive testing. If there was a problem, they would have identified it. Your concern is noted, but this conversation is over. Return to your station." Margaret returned to her inspection bench, but she couldn't let it go. That evening she visited the plant library, a small room where technical manuals and specifications were stored. She found the complete assembly specifications for the SCR 300 and began reading. The radio was extraordinarily complex, containing 147 discrete components and over 30 feet of internal wiring. The frequency oscillator was the critical component that determined signal clarity. It operated at 4 megahertz and required precise voltage stability. She traced the wiring diagrams following each connection. The new redundant lines ran within millimeters of the oscillator leads for approximately 6 inches. If cold temperatures caused the insulation to contract even slightly, the conductors could move closer together. At radio frequencies, even tiny changes in spacing could cause capacitive coupling, allowing signal energy to leak between adjacent wires. The result would be exactly what field reports described: signal degradation that worsened as temperatures dropped. The solution, Margaret realized, was absurdly simple. If the wires were held in rigid alignment, maintaining consistent spacing regardless of temperature, the interference would never occur. But what material could provide that rigidity without adding significant weight or cost? Metal brackets would be too heavy. Plastic spacers would require retooling dies. The modification needed to be something that could be implemented immediately using existing materials. She thought about this problem for 3 days while inspecting wire harnesses. On the 3rd day, As she reached up to adjust her hair, pinned back in the style required by factory safety regulations, the answer literally came from her own head. A hairpin. The simple wire hairpin that kept her hair secured was exactly the right gauge of spring steel. It was rigid enough to maintain spacing, but flexible enough to be shaped. Most importantly, it was already mass-produced at a cost of less than 5 cents. A single hairpin, bent into a specific shape and positioned between the oscillator leads and the new redundant wiring, would maintain consistent spacing under all temperature conditions. Margaret spent her evening in her family's cramped apartment kitchen, using needle-nose pliers from her brother's toolbox to shape hairpins into different configurations. She tested spring tension, tried various placement angles, and measured spacing with a ruler borrowed from her younger sister's school supplies. By midnight, she had a design that maintained exactly 1/4 inch separation between the conductors. The next morning, she arrived at the factory an hour early. She found Mr. Donnelly in his office preparing for the day shift. "Mr. Donnelly, I need 5 minutes," she said. Donnelly looked up, clearly surprised to see her. "Flynn, I thought we settled this." "I have a solution," Margaret said, holding up a hairpin she had carefully shaped the previous night. "This will fix the cold weather failures. I can demonstrate right now." Something in her voice must have convinced him, because Donnelly set down his coffee and followed her to the inspection area. Margaret had brought one of the new wire harness assemblies and a hairpin modified to her specifications. She explained her theory about capacitive coupling, using terms she had learned from the technical manuals. She demonstrated how cold temperatures would cause insulation contraction, reducing the spacing between parallel conductors. Then she showed how the hairpin, positioned at 3 key points along the harness, maintained rigid spacing regardless of temperature changes. Donnelly listened, his expression shifting from skepticism to interest. When Margaret finished, he picked up the modified harness and examined the hairpin placement. "This is clever," he admitted, "but I can't authorize a design change based on one person's theory. We'd need to test it. And even if it works, getting military approval for a modification would take months." "Then let's test it," Margaret said. "We have a cold storage room for temperature-sensitive materials. Put this harness in the freezer overnight alongside an unmodified one. Tomorrow we test both." Donnelly considered this. Finally he nodded. "All right, Flynn, we'll test it. But if this is wrong, you go back to inspection, and we never discuss your engineering theories again." That night, 2 wire harnesses went into the factory's cold storage room, which maintained temperatures of 0 degrees Fahrenheit. One harness was standard specification. The other included Margaret's hairpin modification. The next morning, Donnelly brought both harnesses to the testing department. The results were stunning. The standard harness showed exactly the signal degradation that field reports had described. Oscilloscope readings revealed significant interference between the oscillator leads and the adjacent redundant wiring. Signal clarity degraded by 43%. The modified harness with Margaret's hairpin spacers maintained perfect signal integrity. The oscilloscope showed clean, stable frequencies with 0 interference. Donnelly stared at the test results for a long moment. Then he turned to Margaret. "How soon can you document this modification with proper engineering drawings?" Margaret had already prepared them. She pulled a folder from her bag containing detailed sketches, measurements, and step-by-step installation instructions. She had worked on them every evening for a week. Donnelly took the folder to his supervisor. Within 3 hours, Margaret found herself in a conference room with Continental's chief engineer, a man named Dr. Raymond Foster, who held 2 engineering degrees from MIT. She explained her findings again, this time to an audience of 5 senior engineers. Dr. Foster asked sharp, probing questions. He challenged her assumptions about capacitive coupling. He questioned whether her testing methodology was sufficiently rigorous. But as Margaret answered each question, referencing specific sections of the technical manuals she had memorized, his skepticism transformed into something approaching respect. The final question came from Foster himself. "Miss Flynn," he said, "how did you develop this understanding of radio frequency interference without formal engineering training?" Margaret chose her words carefully. "I've been inspecting radio components for 18 months. I pay attention to patterns. When I saw field failure reports correlating with cold weather, I looked for temperature-sensitive factors. The wiring proximity was the obvious variable. The solution needed to be simple, cost-effective, and implementable immediately. A hairpin met all those requirements. Foster nodded slowly. Within 24 hours, Continental Radio had submitted an emergency engineering change request to the Signal Corps at Fort Monmouth. Major Patricia Kowalski, who had spent 9 months investigating the cold weather failures, reviewed the proposal. She immediately recognized its potential. Kowalski arranged for rapid testing at Fort Monmouth. Military technicians modified 5 SCR-300 radios using Margaret's hairpin technique. They subjected the radios to temperature cycling between -20 degrees and 80 degrees Fahrenheit. They tested them in humidity chambers, vibration tables, and electromagnetic interference environments. Every test confirmed Margaret's findings. The hairpin modification eliminated the cold weather signal degradation completely. By early December 1944, the Signal Corps had approved the modification for immediate field implementation. But distributing the modification to units already in Europe presented enormous logistical challenges. Thousands of radios were scattered across the European theatre. Shipping modified wire harnesses would take weeks. The situation in Belgium, where German forces had launched their winter counteroffensive, made delay unacceptable. This is where the story returns to Captain Robert Chen and his malfunctioning radio in the Ardennes forest. Chen commanded a forward artillery observation unit responsible for coordinating fire support for 3 battalions spread across 16 square miles of dense forest. His SCR-300 radio was his only link to battalion headquarters and the artillery batteries that could provide covering fire. When the radio failed on December 8th, Chen faced an impossible situation. His unit had identified German positions preparing for an advance. Without communication, he couldn't request artillery support. Without artillery support, the 3 battalions in his sector would face the advancing forces without covering fire. Chen's radio operator, Corporal James Mitchell, had tried everything standard procedure suggested. He had replaced vacuum tubes, checked power connections, and adjusted the antenna. Nothing worked. The radio produced only static. What Mitchell didn't know was that help was already en route. Major Kowalski had convinced the Signal Corps to implement an emergency field modification program. Rather than waiting for modified harnesses to be manufactured and shipped, they would distribute the hairpin modification directly to radio operators, with simple instructions for field installation. The instructions arrived via courier to division headquarters on December 9th. A Signal Corps tech sergeant named Daniel Wu received the package containing 100 hairpins and a single-page instruction sheet. Wu had never heard of Margaret Flynn. He knew nothing about the months of investigation that had preceded this modification. He simply followed orders to distribute hairpins to forward radio units with instructions for installation. Wu reached Chen's position on December 10th, traveling through snow-covered forest on a supply jeep. He found Captain Chen frustrated and exhausted after 48 hours without radio communication. Wu explained the modification, using the instruction sheet Margaret had written. "Captain, this is going to sound strange," Wu said, "but military engineers have determined that a hairpin modification will fix your cold weather radio problems." Chen looked at the hairpin Wu held, then at the radio. "You're telling me that a piece of wire shaped like a hairpin will fix a radio that costs $400? Wu shrugged. "Sir, I'm just following orders. The instructions say this works. Let's try it." Together, Chen, Mitchell, and Wu removed the wire harness from the SCR-300. Following Margaret's detailed instructions, they positioned 3 hairpins at specific points along the harness, maintaining precise spacing between the oscillator leads and adjacent wiring. The entire modification took 12 minutes. When they powered up the radio, Mitchell's expression shifted from skepticism to amazement. The static was gone. Clear, strong signals came through the headset. Within 5 minutes, Chen had established contact with battalion headquarters. Within 20 minutes, he had transmitted coordinates for German positions. Within 40 minutes, artillery support was responding to his calls. The modification spread rapidly through radio units across the European theatre. By late December, over 3,000 SCR-300 radios had been modified using Margaret's hairpin technique. Field failure rates dropped from 30% to less than 2%. Communication reliability improved dramatically during the critical winter operations. Back in New Jersey, Margaret's life had changed considerably. The Signal Corps requested her presence at Fort Monmouth for a formal recognition ceremony. On January 15, 1945, Brigadier General William Harrison presented Margaret with the Meritorious Civilian Service Award, one of the highest honors the military could grant to a civilian employee. The ceremony was small but significant. Major Kowalski attended, as did Dr. Foster from Continental Radio. Lieutenant Colonel Brennan, who had spent 8 months searching for the Radio Flaw's cause, shook Margaret's hand and told her that her modification had been the breakthrough his team needed. "What impressed me most," Brennan said, "wasn't just that you found the solution. It was that you recognized a problem everyone else had missed and persisted, despite being told you were wrong." Margaret's response was characteristically modest. "I just paid attention to patterns. Sometimes the simplest solution is the right one." The military awarded Continental Radio an additional contract to implement Margaret's modification across all SCR 300 production. More significantly for Margaret personally, Continental promoted her to the position of technical inspector, with authority to review and approve engineering modifications. Her salary increased to $1.12 per hour, nearly double her previous pay. But the impact of Margaret's hairpin modification extended far beyond her personal recognition. Captain Chen's unit successfully coordinated artillery support during critical operations in Belgium, contributing to the defense against the German winter offensive. The improved radio reliability affected operations across multiple fronts. Units in the Italian mountains, where the problem had first been identified, reported dramatically improved communication capability. Arctic operations in Norway benefited from the modification's effectiveness in extreme cold. Signal Corps engineers estimated that improved radio reliability, resulting from Margaret's modification, contributed to successful operations involving approximately 40,000 troops during the final 6 months of the European conflict. While it's impossible to calculate exactly how many lives were saved by reliable communication, field commanders consistently cited improved coordination as a factor in reducing casualties during winter operations. The story of the hairpin modification became legendary within the Signal Corps, though it remained classified information until after the war ended. When the full account was finally declassified in 1946, newspapers across the country ran stories about the teenage factory worker who had outsmarted military engineers. Margaret received interview requests from dozens of publications, most of which she declined. One interview she did accept was with the Journal of the Institute of Radio Engineers, a technical publication that wanted to document the modification for the engineering community. The article, published in March 1946, provided detailed technical analysis of Margaret's solution. It noted that her insight about capacitive coupling between parallel conductors had been correct, that her analysis of temperature-dependent insulation contraction had been accurate, and that her solution had been not only effective, but remarkably economical. The total material cost of modifying each radio, the article noted, was approximately 4 cents. The total time required for field modification was between 10 and 15 minutes. Compare this to the alternative. Manufacturing and shipping new wire harnesses would have cost approximately $14 per unit and required 6 to 8 weeks for distribution. Margaret's solution had saved the military over $160,000 in parts costs alone, not accounting for the incalculable value of improved operational capability. Perhaps the most interesting postscript to this story involves what happened to Margaret after the war ended. Continental Radio offered her a position as a junior engineer, contingent on her completing college courses in electrical engineering. The company agreed to pay for her education while she continued working part-time in the technical inspection department. Margaret accepted the offer. She enrolled at Newark College of Engineering in September 1946, one of 17 women in an incoming class of 412 students. She completed her degree in 5 years while working 20 hours per week at Continental. Upon graduation in 1951, she became one of the first women to hold a full engineering position at a major military contractor. Her career spanned 3 decades. She contributed to the development of transistorized radio systems, satellite communication technologies, and early computer networking protocols. She held 14 patents, published 23 technical papers, and mentored dozens of young engineers. But throughout her career, she remained most proud of the hairpin modification, not because it was her most technically sophisticated achievement, but because it represented a fundamental principle she never abandoned. Effective solutions often emerge from careful observation, creative thinking, and the courage to challenge assumptions. The SCR-300 radios, modified with Margaret's hairpins, remained in military service until 1953. Several examples are preserved in military museums, including one at the Signal Corps Museum at Fort Gordon, Georgia. The museum display includes one of Margaret's original hairpins, alongside the instruction sheet she wrote for field modification. The placard notes that this simple piece of bent wire, costing less than 5 cents, contributed to improved communication reliability for thousands of soldiers during critical winter operations. For Margaret herself, the most meaningful recognition came not from military officials or engineering societies, but from a letter she received in April 1945. It was written by Captain Robert Chen, whose radio had been one of the first modified using her hairpin technique. "Dear Miss Flynn," Chen wrote, "I wanted you to know that the radio modification you designed reached my unit in December, during some of the most difficult days we experienced. The ability to restore communication made a difference I cannot adequately express in words. Because of your ingenuity, I could coordinate support for the men under my command. Because of your persistence in pursuing a solution despite resistance, we had the tools we needed when we needed them most. I don't know if anyone has properly thanked you for this, so please accept my gratitude on behalf of everyone who benefited from your work. You gave us our voices back when we needed them most." Margaret kept that letter for the rest of her life. In later years, when students asked her about her most important achievement, she would show them Chen's letter and explain that engineering wasn't about creating complexity. It was about solving problems that mattered, using whatever resources were available, and never accepting that something couldn't be improved simply because experts said it was already good enough. The hairpin modification story demonstrates several enduring principles. First, that observation and pattern recognition can sometimes reveal solutions that escape formal analysis. Margaret succeeded not because she had superior training, but because she paid attention to correlations others missed. Second, that effective solutions needn't be complex or expensive. The hairpin cost less than a nickel, but solved a problem that had consumed 8 months of engineering investigation and cost the military significant operational capability. Third, that persistence matters. Margaret faced dismissal and condescension, but continued pursuing her insight because she believed it was correct. Most importantly, the story illustrates that expertise and credentials, while valuable, don't hold a monopoly on insight. Margaret Flynn, a 19-year-old factory inspector who had left school after 9th grade, identified and solved a critical engineering problem that had stumped teams of university-trained engineers. Her success didn't diminish the value of formal education. Rather, it demonstrated that diverse perspectives and unconventional approaches can complement traditional expertise. The legacy of Margaret's modification extended beyond the immediate tactical benefits. Signal Corps engineers incorporated her insights into subsequent radio designs, improving wire spacing standards and implementing better practices for preventing electromagnetic interference. Her success helped open doors for women in technical fields, demonstrating that capability mattered more than credentials or gender. Continental Radio's decision to sponsor her engineering education reflected a broader recognition that talent could emerge from unexpected sources. By the time Margaret retired from Continental in 1976, the company employed 143 women in engineering and technical positions, a dramatic change from 1944, when women were largely relegated to inspection and assembly roles. Margaret had mentored many of these women personally, sharing not just technical knowledge but the lesson that had defined her own career: pay attention, think creatively, and never accept that a problem is unsolvable simply because others say it is. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.